In 1937, the H-7 Prometheus and its five-man crew vanished during a celebrated transatlantic flight. The world accepted they were lost to a violent, unforgiving storm at sea. 70 years later, in 2007, a demolition crew would break the seal on a forgotten hangar, revealing a truth that was never buried in the ocean, but meticulously hidden on solid ground, preserved by decades of silence and welded steel. The accepted history of a tragic accident was about to be rewritten as a cold-blooded crime. The spring of 1937 was a season of profound technological optimism in America, a nation clawing its way out of the Great Depression. In rural Ohio, Blackwood Aeronautics was the epicenter of this new hope. Its founder, Silas Blackwood, was a charismatic industrialist who sold the public a vision of the future that floated gracefully through the clouds. His company was not just building machines, it was crafting a new era of luxury travel, and the Prometheus was to be its crowning achievement. The H-7 Prometheus was a marvel of private engineering, a silver behemoth longer than 3 football fields. It represented the pinnacle of lighter-than-air technology, a silent, majestic vessel designed to conquer the Atlantic. To the public fed a steady diet of breathless newspaper articles and radio reports, the Airship was more than a machine. It was a symbol of American ingenuity and ambition, a gleaming promise that the sky was no longer the limit, but a new frontier to be tamed. Silas Blackwood presented himself not merely as a CEO, but as a visionary. He was a master of public relations, a handsome and articulate figure who spoke of progress and destiny. He handpicked the crew himself, framing their mission as a patriotic duty as much as a commercial venture. This flight from Ohio to Paris was designed to be a spectacle, a flawless demonstration of power and safety that would attract wealthy investors and, more importantly, lucrative military contracts for his burgeoning empire. The 5 men chosen to pilot the Prometheus were the best in their field, veterans of countless flights with impeccable records. They were seasoned professionals who understood the risks but possessed an unshakable faith in their machine and their commander. Captain Ivan Rossoff, co-pilot William Finch, navigator Samuel Reed, and radio operator James Cole were all men at the peak of their careers, their names synonymous with reliability and courage in the small, close-knit community of aeronauts. Leading them was Chief Engineer Alistair Thorne, a brilliant and meticulous man considered the true genius behind the Prometheus' revolutionary design. He was Silas Blackwood's most trusted mind, the one who knew every rivet, wire, and gear of the massive airship. For Thorne, this flight was the culmination of a life's work. His letters home to his wife and young son were filled with a palpable excitement, detailing the final preparations for a journey that would secure their family's future and his own legacy. The community surrounding the Blackwood airfield buzzed with an energy that bordered on feverish. The launch was a major local event, a source of immense pride and economic hope for a region still bearing the scars of economic hardship. Families of the crew and company workers saw the Prometheus not just as a corporate asset, but as their vessel, their shared dream. Its success was their success, a belief that Silas Blackwood had carefully cultivated through speeches and company picnics, fostering a powerful sense of loyalty. On the morning of May 12, 1937, the Ohio sky was a brilliant cloudless blue, a perfect omen. The air was cool and still as the ground crew completed their final preparations, their movements precise and practiced. A small crowd of journalists and invited guests gathered at a respectful distance, cameras flashing as the 5 crewmen, clad in their crisp uniforms, walked across the tarmac. They waved to the onlookers, their faces etched with a calm confidence that radiated from their leader, Alistair Thorne. The final hours on the ground were a blur of procedural checks and confirmations. Alistair Thorne personally inspected the engine housing one last time, signing off on the pre-flight log with a steady hand. Captain Rossoff coordinated with the ground team, his voice calm and authoritative over the radio. Silas Blackwood himself was a visible presence, shaking each crewman's hand, a portrait of the proud patriarch sending his sons off on a historic quest. He clapped Thorne on the back, a gesture of ultimate faith. The last public photograph taken of the crew shows them standing together at the base of the gangway, smiling for the cameras. There is no hint of fear or apprehension in their eyes, only the focused determination of men who believed they were on the cusp of making history. They were pioneers, standing before their chariot to the heavens. For their families watching from the viewing area, it was a moment of overwhelming pride, a memory that would soon become an unbearable, haunting image. As the massive airship was untethered from its mooring mast, a reverent silence fell over the airfield. The Prometheus lifted with a silent, almost ethereal grace, its silver skin catching the morning sun. It ascended slowly, a testament to the power of human intellect over the laws of gravity. On the ground, Silas Blackwood watched with a proprietary gaze, his expression unreadable, as his creation floated skyward, carrying the lives of 5 men and the full weight of his corporate ambitions. The final radio transmission from the Prometheus was received just minutes after takeoff, as it cleared the local airspace and set its course east. The voice of Captain Rossoff was clear and steady, reporting, "All systems nominal. Course set for the Atlantic corridor. The Prometheus is flying beautifully." It was a routine, confident message, the last one the world would ever hear from the airship's crew. Then there was only the vast, expectant silence of the open sky. Hours passed. The first scheduled check-in, expected as the airship passed over the Canadian coast, never came. At first, the radio silence was dismissed as a minor technical glitch, perhaps atmospheric interference. In the Blackwood Aeronautics control room, the mood was one of cautious patience. But as the second and then third reporting windows were missed, a quiet unease began to curdle into a cold, creeping dread. The silver speck that had disappeared into the horizon had truly vanished. Panic was a slow-growing vine. By nightfall, it was clear that something was terribly wrong. Blackwood Aeronautics officially declared the Prometheus missing. The news crackled across radio waves and was rushed into the late editions of newspapers. The story of a triumphant journey instantly transformed into a mystery fraught with peril. A massive search and rescue operation was launched, with ships and planes from both the U.S. and Canadian Coast Guards dispatched to scour the vast, empty expanse of the North Atlantic. Silas Blackwood became the public face of the tragedy. He held daily press conferences, his face a mask of grief and steely resolve. He spoke of the crew as heroes, as family. He personally directed the search efforts, sparing no expense, and vowing that he would not rest until his men were found. His performance was masterful. He was the devastated but strong leader, a man wrestling with a catastrophe that had stolen his greatest achievement and his most trusted colleagues. The official narrative began to solidify within days, guided by Blackwood's carefully chosen words. He spoke of a possible encounter with a rogue storm, a sudden and unusually violent weather system that was not on any forecast. This theory took hold, offering a plausible, if tragic explanation. The mighty Prometheus, for all its technological prowess, had been humbled by the raw, unpredictable power of nature. It was a story of hubris and fate, a narrative the public could easily understand and accept. The search of the Atlantic was vast and exhaustive, but ultimately fruitless. For weeks, planes flew grid patterns and ships dragged the ocean floor, but they found nothing. Not a single piece of wreckage, not an oil slick, not a life vest. It was as if the 200-ton airship and its 5 occupants had simply been erased from existence. The complete absence of evidence was unsettling, but it was also used to support the rogue storm theory. The destruction must have been so total, so instantaneous. The families of the crew were left in a state of suspended agony. Without a body to bury or a crash site to mourn, they were trapped in a limbo of unanswered questions. They clung to the official story because it was the only one they had, a narrative of heroic sacrifice against the elements. Yet, a quiet, gnawing doubt persisted. How could something so large vanish so completely? Their grief was a wound that could not close, a permanent fixture in their lives. For Alistair Thorne's family, the loss was defining. His young son, Eris's future father, would grow up in the shadow of a legendary grandfather he never knew, a hero lost to the sea. The Thorne family history became intertwined with this single tragic event. The story of Alistair's final brave flight was passed down through generations, a tale of both immense pride and profound unresolved sorrow that would shape the destiny of his descendants in ways no one could yet imagine. The world eventually moved on. The story of the Prometheus became a footnote in aviation history, a cautionary tale taught to aspiring pilots and engineers. The mystery faded into a settled fact, and Blackwood Aeronautics, after a period of public mourning, recovered and went on to become a defense industry giant. Silas Blackwood died decades later, a celebrated pioneer of American industry, his legacy untarnished by the tragedy that had, by all appearances, cost him so much. The official verdict was lost at sea, cause unknown but presumed to be catastrophic weather. The case files were closed, archived, and left to gather dust. The open wound of 1937 scabbed over, becoming a scar of historical record. The names of the 5 crewmen were etched onto a memorial plaque at the Blackwood corporate headquarters, their sacrifice framed as a noble, unavoidable cost of progress. The narrative was complete, accepted by all. But the truth was not subject to weather patterns or the unforgiving depths of the ocean. It was not a story of man versus nature. It was a story of man versus man, a secret kept not by the sea, but by concrete and steel. The definitive evidence of what happened on that clear spring morning in 1937 was not scattered across the Atlantic floor, but was waiting perfectly preserved in the silent, airtight darkness of a forgotten building. Decades passed. The Blackwood airfield was decommissioned, sold off, and largely forgotten, a relic of a bygone era. The world outside its fences changed irrevocably, shaped by new wars and new technologies. Yet inside one specific hangar, its main door welded shut for reasons no one alive could remember. Time stood still. The dust settled, but the physical truth of that final day remained untouched. A crime scene waiting for an audience. For 70 years, the official story was the only story. It was taught in schools, written in books, and accepted by the families who had no other choice. The 5 brave men of the Prometheus were martyrs, their fate a sad but sealed chapter. But the narrative, so carefully constructed and widely believed, was a complete fabrication. What really happened to the crew was a secret far darker than anyone could have possibly imagined. The official account was a lie, designed to protect a legacy built on ambition and ruthlessness. The truth was not lost in a storm. It had been deliberately and systematically buried on the very ground the Prometheus was said to have left behind. The key to unraveling it all was not in the sky or the sea, but in a place no one had thought to look for 7 decades. Who then truly benefited from their eternal silence? The year 2007 brought with it a different kind of progress. The sprawling, forgotten grounds of the former Blackwood airfield were slated for demolition to make way for a modern logistics hub. For decades, the property had been a ghost, its concrete runways cracked and overrun with weeds, its buildings decaying monuments to a forgotten era of ambition. A skeleton crew of contractors was tasked with the initial clearing, their heavy machinery a stark contrast to the silent history of the place. They were men paid to erase the past, not to uncover it, their focus on schedules and blueprints, not on secrets. Among the dilapidated structures stood Hangar 7, an anomaly on the demolition plans. Unlike the other buildings, which were succumbing to time and neglect, its massive main door was sealed shut, not by rust, but by a thick industrial weld that ran its entire perimeter. It was a deliberate and permanent closure, an act of industrial finality that puzzled the foreman. The original work order listed the hangar as empty, a simple teardown. But the welded seal suggested something inside was meant to stay inside forever. Curiosity, mixed with professional necessity, dictated they would have to cut their way in. The screech of the plasma cutter slicing through 70-year-old steel was the first sound to disturb the hangar's long silence. Sparks rained down onto the dusty tarmac as the workers carved a man-sized opening into the metal door, the air filling with the acrid smell of burnt metal and ancient paint. When the final cut was made, a section of the door fell inward with a deafening clang, kicking up a plume of dust that had not been disturbed since the Great Depression. A cool, unnaturally still air seeped out from the dark interior, carrying with it the scent of stagnation and time itself. Inside, the hangar was a sepulchral time capsule. The air was dry and cold, perfectly preserved. A thick uniform layer of dust coated every surface, softening the hard edges of workbenches and machinery. Unlike the other derelict buildings, this one showed no signs of vandalism or decay. It was hermetically sealed against the outside world. The demolition crew stepped through their makeshift doorway, their flashlights cutting sharp beams through the darkness. They expected to find old equipment or perhaps a forgotten prototype. They were entirely unprepared for what they found instead, huddled in the center of the vast, empty floor. There, arranged in a loose, unnatural cluster, were 5 human skeletons. They were fully intact, some still draped in the tattered, dust-caked remnants of what looked like old uniforms. There was no wreckage, no sign of a catastrophic event, no scattered debris from a crashed airship. The scene was eerily calm, a tableau of death that was both silent and profound. The skeletons were not the result of an accident. They were a deliberate arrangement. The foreman, a hardened man who had seen his share of industrial accidents, felt a cold dread creep up his spine. He immediately backed out and called the Ohio State Police. Dr. Aris Thorne had dedicated his life to the academic pursuit of history, specifically the golden age of aviation. His specialty was the very era that had claimed his grandfather, Alistair Thorne, the brilliant chief engineer of the H-7 Prometheus. Aris had grown up with the legend, a story of a hero lost to an unforgiving Atlantic storm. He had analyzed the official reports, read the newspaper clippings, and even written scholarly articles on the very incident that defined his family's lineage. The official narrative was a cornerstone of his personal and professional identity, a tragic but accepted fact. The call from the Ohio State Police was a fissure that cracked the very foundation of his world. A detective, his voice carefully neutral, informed him that human remains had been discovered at the old Blackwood airfield. He explained that personal effects found with one of the bodies, a tarnished silver locket containing a photo of a woman and a small boy, bore the initials A.T. The detective asked if Aris would be willing to come to the site. Aris felt a dizzying sense of vertigo, the carefully constructed history of his family beginning to fracture in real time. When Aris arrived, the abandoned airfield had been transformed into a major crime scene, swarming with police cruisers, forensic vans, and investigators in white hazmat suits. He was escorted past the yellow tape and into the cavernous, artificially lit space of Hangar 7. There, on the dusty floor, were the 5 skeletons, now marked with evidence tags. He saw the locket cleaned and placed in an evidence bag. It was his grandmother's wedding gift to Alistair. The sight confirmed the impossible. The grandfather he believed was resting at the bottom of the ocean had never even left the ground. The lead detective, a seasoned cold case specialist named Miles Corbin, walked Aris through the scene. He pointed out the lack of any structural damage to the hangar, the pristine condition of the tools on the nearby workbenches, the absence of any scorch marks or signs of a fire. "This wasn't a crash, Dr. Thorne," Corbin said, his voice low. "There was no airship in here. Whatever happened to these men, it happened right where they lie. This place wasn't a tomb for a machine, it was a tomb for them." The detective's words hung in the sterile air, erasing a lifetime of accepted truth. Aris, his historian's mind struggling to process the raw, emotional data before him, felt a profound sense of dislocation. The men of the Prometheus were not victims of nature's fury, but of something else entirely. They had not bravely faced a storm over the ocean. They had met their end on this cold concrete floor in rural Ohio. The story of their heroic demise, the narrative that had been a source of both pride and sorrow for his family for 70 years, was a carefully constructed lie. The question was no longer how they died, but who had lied about it. The initial forensic analysis delivered a far more shocking revelation, transforming the mystery into a full-blown homicide investigation. The county medical examiner, after a preliminary on-site inspection, confirmed what the bizarre scene suggested. There were no injuries consistent with a fall or a high-impact crash. Instead, each of the 5 skulls displayed distinct signs of catastrophic trauma, fine fracture lines that spoke not of an accident, but of a deliberate, violent act. The evidence pointed away from a tragic mechanical failure and toward a brutal, calculated execution. As the forensic team meticulously swept the area around the remains, they found something more. Embedded in the concrete floor beneath 2 of the skeletons were small, deformed pieces of lead. Ballistics experts were called in, and their findings were swift and unequivocal. The fragments were from small-caliber pistol rounds, fired at close range. The fractures on the skulls were consistent with blunt force trauma, but the bullets confirmed the ultimate cause. These men had been murdered, their deaths methodical and clinical. This hangar was not just a tomb, it was a 70-year-old execution chamber. The official story of the Prometheus was not just wrong, it was an elaborate and monstrous deception. The massive international search, the grieving press conferences held by Silas Blackwood, the accepted historical record of a tragic loss at sea, it was all a fabrication. A curtain had been pulled back to reveal a far uglier truth. The 5 heroes of aviation had not been lost to the elements. They had been killed, their bodies sealed away, and their memory used to support a lie that had held for 7 decades. For Aris Thorne, the revelation was both devastating and galvanizing. The grief he had inherited was now supplanted by a cold, burning anger. His grandfather was not a martyr to progress. He was a murder victim. This discovery recontextualized everything he thought he knew about his family, about Blackwood Aeronautics, and about the celebrated pioneer Silas Blackwood himself. He was no longer just a historian studying a distant event. He was the grandson of a murdered man, and he now had a singular purpose: to find the truth, no matter how deep it was buried. Detective Corbin officially reopened the case of the Prometheus crew, reclassifying it from a cold missing persons file to an active quintuple homicide. The challenge was immense. The crime was 70 years old, the potential witnesses long dead, and the original investigation deliberately misdirected to look thousands of miles away. The entire foundation of the case had been built on a lie, meaning every official document from 1937 was now suspect, potentially part of a larger conspiracy to conceal the truth of what happened in Hangar 7. The news of the discovery broke like a bombshell, a historical mystery suddenly becoming a modern headline. The story of the ghost crew of Hangar 7 captured the public imagination. How could 5 men and a massive airship vanish, only for the men to be found decades later, executed on the very airfield they supposedly departed. The narrative of a tragic accident was replaced by the chilling specter of a cold-blooded conspiracy, raising 1,000 new questions for every old one it answered. Eris Thorne and Detective Corbin formed an unlikely partnership. The historian, with his deep academic knowledge of the era, the company, and the people involved, and the detective, with his methodical approach to evidence and motive. They stood before a puzzle 70 years in the making, with most of the pieces lost to time. Their investigation would not be about searching the ocean, but about excavating the past, digging through yellowed corporate archives, and long-forgotten records for the hint of a motive. The primary suspect, by virtue of his position and his role in crafting the original narrative, was Silas Blackwood himself. But Blackwood had died a celebrated icon of industry decades ago, his legacy seemingly untouchable. Accusing a dead national hero of mass murder was an extraordinary claim that would require extraordinary proof. They needed to find a motive powerful enough for a man to execute his 5 most trusted employees and orchestrate a cover-up on an international scale. What secret was worth that price? The discovery of the bodies had answered the question of where the crew met their end, but it opened up a far more complex line of inquiry. The focus of the mystery shifted entirely. It was no longer about the fate of the Prometheus airship, but about the final moments of the 5 men who were supposed to fly it. Why were they killed? Who pulled the trigger? And who had the power to weld a hangar door shut and make the world look for a ghost ship in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean? The hangar itself became the primary source of evidence, a silent witness to the crime. Forensic teams conducted a microscopic examination of the entire structure, searching for any clue that had survived the passage of 70 years. They dusted for prints that were no longer there, analyzed soil samples, and used ground-penetrating radar to scan the concrete floor for anything else that might have been hidden. The investigation was a race against the decay of time itself, a fight to make the ghosts of the past speak. Aris found himself poring over his grandfather's old letters and personal effects, items he had previously viewed as relics of a hero. Now he searched them for clues, for any hint of discord, fear, or suspicion in the days leading up to the fateful flight. He reread Alistair's last letter home, a document filled with excitement and pride. Was it genuine optimism, or was his grandfather hiding a darker reality behind a brave face? Every word, every sentence was now suspect, potentially holding a double meaning he had never seen before. The state of Ohio, along with the families of the other 4 crewmen, demanded answers. The descendants, who like Eris had grown up with the story of their heroic ancestors, were now confronted with the horrific truth of their murders. The pressure on Corbin's department was immense. They had to solve a crime where the trail had gone cold before most of the current investigators had even been born. The case was a labyrinth of historical documents and faded memories, and the Minotaur at its center was a powerful legacy built on a foundation of lies. The investigation began to focus on the days and hours immediately preceding the launch. What was happening at Blackwood Aeronautics on May 12, 1937? The official records, curated by Blackwood himself, depicted a smooth, flawless preparation for a historic journey. But the 5 skeletons on the hangar floor told a different story. They spoke of a catastrophic event, not in the air, but on the ground, an event so devastating that mass murder became the only solution for the man in charge. The team started digging into the financial and technical records of Blackwood Aeronautics, most of which had been absorbed by a larger defense contractor decades ago and warehoused in a deep archive. Eris theorized that the key to the motive was not personal, but professional. Something must have gone catastrophically wrong with the Prometheus itself, a failure so complete it threatened to destroy Silas Blackwood's reputation and his company. The flight had to be a success in the papers, even if it never left the ground. The hangar, once a symbol of future flight, had become a crypt. The clean, modern lines of the building, as seen in old photographs, now seemed sinister. It was a stage where a grand spectacle of progress was supposed to begin, but it had instead hosted a grim and final act. The silence within its walls was not peaceful. It was heavy with the weight of a secret kept for generations, a truth that had been patiently waiting for the shriek of a plasma cutter to set it free. Detective Corbin knew that solving this case would depend on finding a piece of evidence that had survived the 70-year cover-up. They needed something that directly linked the murders to the man who benefited most from the crew's disappearance. A confession, a witness account, or a piece of physical proof that had been overlooked. They were searching for a needle in a haystack the size of a century, hoping that the killer, for all his meticulous planning, had made one small mistake. The emotional toll on Eris was profound. He was deconstructing the heroic myth of his grandfather, only to reconstruct him as the victim of a brutal crime. Every new piece of information felt like a betrayal of the story he had cherished his entire life. Yet this painful process was also one of liberation. He was finally freeing Alistair Thorne from the gilded cage of a lie, and was on the path to giving him the one thing the official story never could: the truth of his final moments and justice for his murder. The discovery of the bodies in Hangar 7 was the inciting incident, the spark that reignited a long-extinguished fire. The official narrative was dead, shattered on the concrete floor alongside the remains of the 5 men it was designed to entomb. The world now knew the story of the Prometheus was a lie. The real mystery, darker and more complex than anyone had ever imagined, was just beginning to unfold. They had found the victims, but the killer remained a ghost, protected by time and a celebrated legacy. The new investigation had a clear, if daunting, objective: to dismantle the official history piece by piece and expose the crime it was built to hide. Eris Thorne, the historian, had become the keeper of a new narrative, one that would be written not with academic prose, but with police reports, forensic data, and the hard, undeniable evidence of murder. The search for what happened to the Prometheus was over. The hunt for its creator's sins had just begun. The welded door of Hangar 7 had sealed away a crime, preserving the scene with an eerie perfection. Now that the seal was broken, the truth was beginning to seep out, like the cold, still air that first greeted the demolition crew. The skeletons were the first, most shocking piece of the puzzle, a silent testament to a hidden atrocity. They were the undeniable proof that a terrible secret was kept on that airfield. But this discovery was only the first piece of a macabre puzzle that no one was prepared to assemble. The new investigation began not with a manhunt, but with an excavation of history. Detective Miles Corbin and Dr. Eris Thorne established a makeshift headquarters in a climate-controlled trailer just outside the police tape cordoning off Hangar 7. The crime scene was the past itself, and its evidence was buried in mountains of paper, sealed away in corporate vaults. Their primary objective was clear and profoundly difficult: to find a motive powerful enough for a man of Silas Blackwood's stature to murder 5 loyal employees and orchestrate a cover-up of breathtaking audacity. They were not just investigating a crime, they were challenging a legend. Corbin, a man accustomed to tangible evidence and living witnesses, found himself navigating a world of ghosts and faded ink. Every lead was 70 years old. Every potential witness was long dead. Silas Blackwood, the prime and only logical suspect, was a celebrated figure whose public image was a fortress of philanthropy and industrial genius. To posthumously accuse him of quintuple homicide required more than just the presence of bodies. It required an irrefutable narrative explaining why. The burden of proof was immense, a weight of history pressing down on their every move. Their first target was the vast, unorganized archive of Blackwood Aeronautics, which had been acquired decades ago by a defense conglomerate named Omnicorp. Gaining access was a bureaucratic nightmare, a battle of subpoenas and corporate lawyers who were fiercely protective of the Blackwood legacy. When they finally entered the cavernous, climate-controlled warehouse, they were met with rows upon rows of filing cabinets and document boxes, a paper mausoleum holding the secrets of a defunct empire. Somewhere in this labyrinth of technical manuals, financial ledgers, and corporate memos lay the truth. The initial search yielded nothing but frustration. Every public-facing document, from press releases to internal safety reports, painted a picture of flawless preparation for the Prometheus's transatlantic flight. The records were meticulously organized, almost too perfect. It was this very perfection that raised Corbin's suspicions. It felt curated, sanitized. There were no notes of concern, no reports of minor setbacks, no of the usual messy realities of a complex engineering project. It was the corporate equivalent of a pristine crime scene, wiped clean of any incriminating evidence. Aris, leveraging his historian's expertise, decided to ignore the official project files and focus instead on the raw technical data, the blueprints. He knew that while reports could be rewritten, the engineering schematics might tell a different story. Using high-resolution digital scanners and imaging software unavailable, in 1937, his team began creating a digital model of the Prometheus. They analyzed every layer, every revision, every annotation in the margins that had been dismissed as irrelevant 70 years ago. The first major break came from this digital deconstruction. Buried deep within the structural plans for the engine housing were annotations and material specifications that made no sense for a standard hydrogen-lift airship. The power plant described in these hidden layers was far more complex, requiring exotic alloys and a containment system of unprecedented strength. Aris realized they were looking at something that had been deliberately omitted from all public records: a secondary, experimental engine. This discovery changed the entire context of the investigation. The Prometheus was not just a luxury transport, it was a Trojan horse. Its celebrated transatlantic flight was a cover for the secret, real-world testing of a revolutionary, and likely unstable, propulsion system. Aris began cross-referencing the technical specifications with obscure engineering journals from the era, finally identifying the theoretical framework. It was a prototype helium purification engine, a device that, if successful, would have made lighter-than-air travel infinitely safer and given Blackwood Aeronautics an unassailable monopoly on the technology. The motive began to sharpen into focus. This secret engine was Silas Blackwood's ultimate gamble, the key to his entire empire. He had bet everything on its success. If it worked, he would be a global titan. But what if it failed? A public failure of such a radical new technology would not just be embarrassing, it would mean financial ruin, the end of his company, and the collapse of his carefully constructed legacy. The stakes were no longer just about a single flight, but about the survival of Blackwood's entire world. The question then became, what kind of failure could prompt such a brutal response? Aris theorized it must have been catastrophic and undeniable, something that happened on the ground just before takeoff. An explosion? A lethal radiation leak? The pristine condition of the hangar ruled out a fire or major blast, but the skeletons told them something deadly had occurred within those walls. They were looking for evidence of a contained silent catastrophe, one that left no structural damage but was fatal to anyone nearby. Corbin, meanwhile, shifted his team's focus to the financial records, operating on the timeless principle that great conspiracies are almost always anchored in greed. He tasked forensic accountants with rebuilding the 1937 balance sheets of Blackwood Aeronautics. They painstakingly digitized the brittle, yellowed ledgers, searching for anomalies the original auditors might have missed or been instructed to ignore. The numbers, they hoped, would not lie in the same way that people could. The financial analysis revealed a company not on the cusp of a golden age, but teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. Blackwood had poured every last dollar and a significant amount of borrowed capital into the Prometheus project. The company was leveraged to its absolute limit. The success of the transatlantic flight was not just for publicity. It was a desperately needed lifeline to secure new funding and avoid a complete collapse. Blackwood wasn't launching a dream. He was trying to outrun a nightmare of his own making. This financial desperation provided a powerful context for the crime. If the secret engine failed on the ground, Blackwood would lose everything. His investors would pull out, his creditors would call in their loans, and his company would be worthless. However, the accountants discovered another crucial piece of the puzzle, a massive insurance policy taken out on the Prometheus and its crew. The policy had a specific, heavily negotiated clause that guaranteed a full payout in the event the airship was lost at sea, with no wreckage required for the claim. The policy was the missing link. A catastrophic failure on the ground meant ruin. A tragic, heroic loss in the middle of the Atlantic meant a massive cash infusion that would save the company and allow Blackwood to rebuild. The financial incentive was no longer theoretical. It was written in black and white in an insurance contract. He didn't just need the crew to disappear, he needed them to disappear in a very specific way, in a place where they could never be found. With the motive now terrifyingly clear, Aris and Corbin re-examined the timeline of May 12, 1937. The official narrative, crafted by Blackwood himself, spoke of a flawless morning launch. But if the engine failed, when did it happen? And how did Blackwood manage to control the situation so completely? He would have needed accomplices, men on the ground loyal enough or well paid enough to weld a hangar door shut and then perpetuate a global lie. Corbin's team started digging into the employment records of the 1937 ground crew, cross-referencing names with subsequent financial records. They found what they were looking for, a series of large lump sum payments made from Blackwood's personal accounts to a handful of his most trusted security men and a senior foreman in the weeks following the Prometheus disappearance. The payments were disguised as performance bonuses, but their timing was too coincidental. This was the hush money. These men were the silent conspirators, the ones who likely herded the crew into the hangar, carried out the executions under Blackwood's orders, and then welded the door, turning a workshop into a tomb. They were the ones who helped scuttle the empty airship in the ocean, giving credence to the lie. All of them had died decades ago, taking their secrets with them, their silence bought and paid for by the man whose legacy they protected. The case was building, brick by methodical brick, but it remained circumstantial. They had a powerful motive, a clear financial benefit, and evidence of a cover-up. Yet they lacked the final definitive piece of evidence that directly connected Silas Blackwood to the murders themselves. They had the why, but not the irrefutable how. How could they prove what happened inside that hangar during those final terrifying moments? Aris found himself returning again and again to his grandfather. Alistair Thorne was a brilliant engineer, but he was also obsessively meticulous. He documented everything. It was a personality trait his wife had often mentioned in her letters. He kept detailed personal notes on every project, separate from the official company logs. If anyone knew the truth about the engine's instability, it would have been Alistair. And if he knew, he would have written it down. The thought of a hidden logbook became an obsession for Aris. It was the kind of proof trophy that existed more in fiction than in reality. But given his grandfather's character, it felt plausible. He scoured Alistair's last letters home, searching for any clue, any hint about where he might have kept such sensitive documents. He found a cryptic passage in a letter to his wife. "I've made my own little safe space here in the hangar for my private thoughts on our Prometheus. Not even Mr. Blackwood knows where I've tucked them away." This single sentence electrified the investigation. It suggested the existence of a hidden cache of information, a physical object that could have survived the 70-year silence. A secret kept from Silas Blackwood himself might be the one thing the cover-up had missed. The question was, where in the vast 20,000-square-foot hangar could this safe space be? Finding it would be like searching for a single altered stone in a pyramid. Corbin, initially skeptical of what he called the historian's hunch, was swayed by the sheer lack of any other direct evidence. He agreed to authorize one final, exhaustive forensic sweep of Hangar 7, this time with a new objective: to find a hidden compartment. He brought in a specialized team with ground-penetrating radar, thermal imagers, and acoustic resonance equipment designed to detect voids in concrete and steel. For days, the team meticulously scanned every inch of the hangar. They scanned the floors, the support pillars, the cavernous walls. The work was slow, tedious, and yielded nothing. The building appeared to be exactly what it was, a solid shell of concrete and steel. The initial optimism began to fade, and the theory of a hidden logbook started to feel like a desperate flight of fancy, the last hope of a grandson seeking an impossible justice. The discovery was made on the final day of the search, in a place they had already checked twice. A technician using a new form of high-frequency sonar detected a small, acoustically dead spot in the wall behind the location of the chief engineer's former workbench. It was a space no larger than a shoebox, perfectly shielded by a thick steel plate that had been plastered over and painted to match the surrounding wall. It was completely invisible to the naked eye. The team carefully cut away the section of the wall, the screech of their tools echoing in the silent hangar. Behind the plaster and the steel plate was a small, recessed cavity, insulated and fire-resistant, and nestled inside, protected from the ravages of time, was a small, leather-bound engineer's logbook. It was perfectly preserved, its cover embossed with the initials A.T. A reverent silence fell over the investigators as a gloved technician carefully lifted the logbook from its 70-year-old hiding place. Eris Thorne felt his heart pound in his chest, his breath catching in his throat. This was it. This was his grandfather's voice, a message from the grave. He watched as the technician opened the book to the last entry, its pages filled with Alastair Thorne's familiar, precise handwriting. The final entry was dated May 12, 1937. The ink was slightly smeared, the handwriting growing frantic and panicked toward the end. It was not a technical report, but a terrified first-hand account of a corporate dream turning into a bloody nightmare. This book was not just evidence. It was a final testament, the key that would finally unlock the truth of what happened in the last moments of the Prometheus crew. They had found the motive in the archives and the money trail in the ledgers. They had identified the victims on the cold hangar floor. But this logbook was something more. It was the voice of the crime itself, the narrative of the murders as they happened, written by the hand of a man who knew he was about to die. The 70-year-old silence of Hangar 7 was about to be broken not by the hum of an engine, but by the words of a dead man. The truth was no longer a matter of historical reconstruction or circumstantial evidence. It was now a matter of turning the page. What secrets were contained in that final, desperate entry? The investigation had reached its tipping point, moving from the methodical reconstruction of the past to the precipice of a direct revelation. The logbook was the bridge between suspicion and certainty, the one piece of evidence that Silas Blackwood's meticulous cover-up had failed to account for. Corbin placed a hand on Eris's shoulder, his expression grim and resolute. "Let's see what your grandfather has to tell us," he said, his voice low. The contents of that book would not only solve a 70-year-old murder, but would also bring the carefully constructed legacy of a celebrated American icon crashing down into ruin. They had pieced together the fragments of a conspiracy, following a trail of breadcrumbs left across 7 decades of carefully constructed lies. Now, in their hands, they held the map that led directly to the heart of the crime, a first-hand account of betrayal and murder. The logbook represented the final, irrefutable link in a chain of evidence that stretched from the present day all the way back to that clear spring morning in 1937. Its discovery confirmed that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of enduring, waiting for the right moment to be unearthed. The search for clues was over. The time for revelation had arrived. The team gathered around as the forensic expert prepared to read the final entry aloud, its words poised to rewrite history and finally expose the monster behind the myth of Silas Blackwood. In the sterile, artificially lit cavern of Hangar 7, a forensic specialist with gloved hands held the leather-bound logbook. The air was thick with anticipation, a 70-year silence poised to be broken. Dr. Eris Thorne stood beside Detective Corbin, his entire body rigid, his gaze locked on the small book that represented his family's lost history. This was the moment of truth, the culmination of a lifelong search and a modern, intensive investigation. The pages, yellowed but perfectly preserved, contained the final thoughts of a man who knew he was about to be erased from the world. Every person in the hangar understood they were about to become witnesses to a confession delivered from beyond the grave, an account of betrayal that had been patiently waiting for an audience. The specialist cleared his throat, his voice steady but somber, as he began to read the final entry aloud. The date at the top of the page was stark, May 12, 1937. Alistair Thorne's handwriting, usually so precise and controlled, began with a clinical observation that quickly devolved into panicked, jagged strokes. Final pre-flight check on the helium purification engine revealed a catastrophic failure in the primary containment vessel, a hairline fracture, undetectable until full pressure was achieved. The system is a total loss, a complete, unmitigated disaster. The words confirmed Eris's theory with chilling finality. The dream of the Prometheus had died on the ground before it ever had a chance to taste the sky. The narrative in the logbook then shifted from technical failure to human horror. "Mr. Blackwood has been informed," the specialist read, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "He is not devastated. He is cold, calculating. He arrived not with engineers, but with his personal security team, 4 men I do not recognize from the ground crew. He looked at the failed engine, then at us, and said the story could not be allowed to die. He insisted that the flight must be a success in the papers, a glorious tragedy, even if it was a catastrophic failure, in fact." The sheer, calculated cynicism of the statement hung in the air, a testament to a monstrous ego. The final sentences of the entry were a desperate, breathless chronicle of the crew's last moments. The ink was smeared, a sign of a hand trembling with fear or urgency. "They are welding the main hangar door from the outside. The sound is deafening. Blackwood is locking us in. He just looked at me, his eyes devoid of any humanity, and told us that we are martyrs now, our sacrifice necessary for the sake of progress. He has a gun. They all have guns. Captain Rosov is trying to reason with him, but it is no use. This logbook is my final testament. My son, God, help us all." The reading concluded, and a profound, horrified silence filled the hangar. The truth was more brutal and personal than anyone had imagined. Silas Blackwood had not simply covered up a mechanical failure. He had personally presided over the execution of his 5 most trusted men. He had looked them in the eyes, declared them martyrs for a lie, and then ordered their deaths to protect his financial empire and his public legacy. He was not a grieving visionary who fell victim to a tragic accident. He was a cold-blooded monster, a man who valued his reputation more than the lives of the people who built it for him. The revelation was absolute, leaving no room for doubt or interpretation. For Eris Thorne, the moment was a cataclysm of emotion. The academic detachment he had maintained throughout the investigation shattered, replaced by a wave of visceral grief and white-hot fury. This was his grandfather's final message, a desperate cry for help that had gone unheard for 70 years. He saw the scene in his mind's eye. Alistair, frantically scribbling in his logbook, hiding it in his secret compartment as the sound of welding sealed his fate. The story of the heroic pioneer lost at sea was replaced by the horrifying image of a brilliant man trapped and murdered by the very patron he had so admired. Detective Corbin placed a firm hand on Eris's shoulder, his expression one of grim certainty. The circumstantial case they had painstakingly built over weeks was now anchored by an irrefutable first-hand account. The logbook was not just a confession. It was a narrative of the crime as it happened. It was the proof trophy that transformed the investigation from a complex historical puzzle into a straightforward, albeit 70-year-old quintuple homicide. The ghost of Silas Blackwood, a celebrated American icon, was about to be put on trial, and this book would serve as the star witness for the prosecution. The confrontation with Blackwood's legacy was swift and public. 2 days later, Detective Corbin stood before a packed press conference. The world's media gathered to hear the final, shocking truth about the legendary H-7 Prometheus. He did not summarize or paraphrase. He simply read Alistair Thorne's final entry into the microphones, his voice carrying the weight of the 70-year-old crime. As the words echoed through the room and across global airwaves, a collective gasp was heard. The carefully constructed myth of Silas Blackwood, the visionary industrialist, began to crumble under the weight of a dead man's testimony. The fallout was immediate and spectacular. Omnicorp, the corporate successor to Blackwood Aeronautics, saw its stock plummet as the company's very foundation was revealed to be a lie built on murder. The board issued a statement expressing shock and horror, immediately moving to distance the modern corporation from the sins of its founder. They announced the creation of a massive restitution fund for the descendants of the 5 crewmen, a tacit admission of the guilt that now stained their corporate history. The name Blackwood, once synonymous with innovation and American ambition, became a byword for ruthless deception and unimaginable cruelty. Historians and academics scrambled to rewrite the annals of aviation history. Textbooks were amended, and museum exhibits were updated. The story of the Prometheus was retold, no longer as a cautionary tale about the perils of nature, but as a chilling case study in corporate psychopathy. Silas Blackwood's statues were debated. His name was stripped from university buildings and philanthropic foundations, and his legacy was irrevocably redefined. He was no longer a pioneer who reached for the stars, but a tyrant who buried his failures in a shallow, unmarked grave on his own property. The logbook provided the final pieces of the puzzle, allowing Corbin's team to reconstruct the crime in its entirety. After the engine failed, Blackwood, facing immediate financial ruin, enacted his contingency plan. He and his paid security detail murdered the 5 crewmen inside the sealed hangar, using both firearms and blunt instruments to ensure their deaths were absolute. They then meticulously removed all evidence of their presence, leaving only the bodies. Under the cover of darkness, a separate team towed the empty, silent Prometheus out to sea and scuttled it, sinking the massive airship in the deep Atlantic to create the illusion of a disappearance. The insurance payout, collected for a tragedy that never happened, was the financial lifeblood that saved Blackwood Aeronautics from bankruptcy and allowed Silas to build his defense industry empire. The international search and rescue operation was a masterful piece of theater, a cynical performance with Blackwood himself playing the role of the grieving patriarch. The entire narrative was a work of fiction, orchestrated by a man who understood that history is often written by those with the power to control the story. For 70 years, his version was the only one the world knew. Justice for Alistair Thorne, Evan Rossoff, William Finch, Samuel Reed, and James Cole could not be served in a courtroom, as their killer and his accomplices were long dead. Instead, justice took the form of historical correction. The official cause of death on their certificates was changed from lost at sea to homicide. The memorial plaque at the Omnicorp headquarters, which praised their brave sacrifice against the elements, was taken down. In its place, a new monument was erected, one that told the true story of their murder at the hands of their employer. The 5 skeletons were finally given a proper burial. A joint funeral was held in Ohio, attended by the descendants of all 5 crewmen, many of whom were meeting for the first time. They were no longer the families of men lost to a mysterious fate, but the survivors of a shared, horrific crime. They found a strange and somber comfort in each other's presence, their individual griefs merging into a collective story of resilience and, finally, of resolution. The wound that had remained open for generations could at last begin to heal, cauterized by the harsh light of the truth. Aris Thorne stood before his grandfather's new headstone, the engraving clear and definitive. Alistair Thorne, chief engineer, a brilliant mind, a loving husband and father, murdered in the pursuit of progress May 12, 1937, his truth finally home. Aris placed a hand on the cool granite, feeling a profound, bittersweet sense of peace. He had not brought his grandfather back, but he had reclaimed his name from the fiction that had imprisoned it. He had replaced the myth of a martyr with the truth of a man, and in doing so, he had fulfilled a duty that stretched across his entire family's history. The logbook was entered into evidence and then released to the Thorne family. Aris held it in his hands, not as a historical artifact, but as a family heirloom. It was a symbol of his grandfather's final act of defiance, a refusal to be silenced completely. Alistair had lost his life, but he had not lost the battle for his own story. He had trusted that someday someone would come looking for the truth, and he had left them a map. Aris had followed that map to its devastating, cathartic conclusion. The resolution brought a quiet dignity back to the names of the 5 victims. They were no longer footnotes in a tale of technological hubris. They were remembered as men of skill and courage who were the first casualties of an empire built on a monstrous secret. Their story became a permanent reminder that the gleaming facade of progress can sometimes hide the darkest of human impulses, and that great ambition, left unchecked by morality, can lead to unspeakable evil. The legend of the Prometheus was dead. The truth of its crew could now live forever. For Detective Corbin, the case was a career-defining moment. He had solved a crime that was older than he was, proving that no case is ever truly cold, as long as a sliver of evidence survives. He had given 5 families the answers they had been denied for decades, dismantling a historical lie with methodical police work and a crucial partnership with a historian who refused to let the past remain buried. It was a testament to the relentless pursuit of facts, a victory for forensic science and historical inquiry working in perfect harmony. The hangar itself, Hangar 7, was not demolished as originally planned. It was preserved, designated as a historical site by the state of Ohio. It stood as a silent, monolithic monument to the crime that had taken place within its walls. It was no longer a forgotten relic of a bygone era, but a solemn reminder of the 5 lives that were sacrificed there. Visitors could now stand outside its massive scarred door and contemplate the weight of the secret it had kept for so long. The emotional closure for Aris was complex. The sorrow for his grandfather's stolen life would always remain, a dull ache in the fabric of his family's story. But it was now intertwined with a fierce pride. His grandfather had not only been a brilliant engineer, but also a man who, in his final moments, had the presence of mind to leave behind the one weapon that could defeat his killer, the truth. The logbook was an act of faith, a belief that justice, however delayed, was not impossible. The revelation of the truth sent a ripple effect through the descendants of the other crew members. They discovered old letters and photographs, sharing stories and piecing together the lives of the men they had only known through the lens of a tragic myth. The discovery forged a new community, one bound by a shared, corrected history. They were united not in the mystery of a loss, but in the certainty of a crime and the final hard-won delivery of justice for their ancestors. The world learned a powerful lesson from the Prometheus case, that history is not immutable. It is a living document subject to revision and correction as new evidence comes to light. The official story, no matter how deeply entrenched or widely accepted, is only as strong as the secrets it keeps. Silas Blackwood had managed to control the narrative for 70 years, but he could not control the physical evidence of his crime. In the end, the concrete and steel of Hangar 7 proved to be a more reliable witness than any corporate press release. The scale of Blackwood's deception was almost as shocking as the murders themselves. He had manipulated governments, the media, and the public on an international scale. He had allowed the families of his victims to grieve for a fiction, a cruel and protracted form of psychological torment. His crime was not just the act of killing 5 men, but the act of erasing them and replacing their reality with a self-serving lie, a lie he profited from for the rest of his celebrated life. Harris often found himself thinking about the nature of time and memory. For 70 years, his family's memory of Alistair was incomplete, defined by a question mark at the end of his story. Now, the story was complete. It was a tragedy, but it was a whole tragedy. There were no more questions, no more lingering doubts. The closure was absolute, a final somber period at the end of a long and painful sentence. He had given his grandfather the one thing Blackwood had tried to steal forever, a true ending. The financial restitution from Omnicorp was substantial, but for the families it was secondary. The real compensation was the restoration of their ancestors' dignity. The money was a symbol, an acknowledgement of the profound wrong that had been committed. Most of the families, including the Thorns, used the funds to establish scholarships and foundations in the names of the 5 crewmen, ensuring their legacies would be associated not with a lie but with education, discovery, and the unwavering pursuit of truth. The final public act was the interment of the logbook. After being digitally archived and studied, the physical book was sealed in a time capsule and buried at the base of the new monument honoring the crew. It had served its purpose. It had spoken its truth and brought a killer's legacy to ruin. Now it could rest, its duty fulfilled, its secrets no longer secrets, but part of the permanent, corrected, historical record for all to see. The investigation officially closed. The files on the Prometheus cold case were marked solved, the quintuple homicide attributed to Silas Blackwood and his unnamed accomplices. The paperwork could never capture the full scope of the story. The decades of silent grief, the historian's obsessive quest, the stunning moment of discovery in a dusty hangar. But it provided a definitive, bureaucratic end to a mystery that had once seemed as vast and unsolvable as the Atlantic Ocean itself. The story of the Prometheus ultimately became a testament to persistence. The persistence of a murderer to protect his legacy, the persistence of a family to understand its past, and the persistence of a detective to solve an impossible crime. It demonstrated that no secret is truly safe, and no lie can be maintained forever. Time does not always heal wounds. Sometimes it simply preserves the evidence needed to expose them. Harris Thorne had started his journey as a historian, a dispassionate scholar of the past. He ended it as a direct participant in the history he studied, the man who had pulled the thread that unraveled a 70-year-old tapestry of lies. He had not only solved a family mystery, he had corrected a national one, proving that a single, determined individual, armed with the right questions, could indeed change the course of history. The final, undeniable truth of the Prometheus was a simple one, though it had taken 7 decades to surface. Men with immense power will sometimes commit monstrous acts to protect that power, but they cannot erase the truth. They can only bury it. And as the events in Hangar 7 proved, some things, once buried, are simply waiting for the right person to come along and start digging. The revelation was now complete, a definitive and brutal truth laid bare for the world to see. But the emotional scars of such a long-held lie would require their own time to fade.